to my partner, Manuela, who gave the presentation earlier this morning. So what I'd like to do is step right into the slides here. And after this brief introduction, we will talk about our stock assessment methods. So let's go to the next slide. So our goal for our stock assessment work is to measure and guide the sustainable balance between conservation and utilization. We know that fisheries can provide food production, they provide jobs, they provide recreational opportunities, but fisheries, I mean, humans are essentially invasive species in the marine ecosystem. We have changed the marine ecosystems, and our job is to understand what that impact is and what is a sustainable level of impact that makes humans as part of the ecosystem to get what we call a blue economy. How do we take advantage of the opportunities the ocean provides and get from it the food production, the opportunities, while protecting the ecosystem and preventing overfishing. And an important part of going for this balance is recognizing that in the face of uncertainty, we err on the side of precaution, that we end up putting our thumb on the side for protection so that we are able to preserve things for the future. Next slide. So there's a common conceptual basis for essentially all living resource impacts. And I boil it down to this cartoon of the system. So if you think over on the right-hand side, where the fraction of the fish that are out there that are caught each year is approaching zero, we end up with fish living to large sizes at old ages, and a lot of benefits happen up at the top right-hand corner. But from this, we don't get very much catch. You move over to the left-hand side where we now have a very high rate of fishing. Well, there's a lot more jobs because more people are out there trying to catch fish, but there's a lot more impact on the fish stock. And you also do not get very much yield, and they aren't very big fish because they don't survive to older ages. Somewhere in the middle is a theoretical maximum, the MSY, maximum sustainable yield. And that conceptual model pervades nearly all of the fishery management guided by sustainable scientific practices. Within this range is something we could call pretty good yield. So fishing towards the right-hand side gives us more benefits and more fish, and fishing on the left side has higher impacts. And trying to understand this balance and guide the system to getting as close as we can to a maximum yield while still protecting the system as well. Next slide. The way we do this is to integrate three basic categories of data into models of the fish populations. So we talked some yesterday about some of these data sources. There's catch, that's basically how much is being removed. There's abundance information, which is an indicator of the trends in the populations over time. And there's biology, growth rates, mortality rates, movement rates, everything we know about the life history of the animals. These three categories are important to constructing reasonable models, reasonable approximations of how the fish populations actually work. And increasingly, we bring into this modeling environmental indicators, ecosystem connections, in order to get a more and more complete picture. So these feed into the assessment models. From the assessment models, we're able to produce time series of the stock abundance over time, the fishing mortality rates, estimates of the overall fish productivity, from which we can derive things we call reference points and control rules. So here's where the interaction with the management system works. So we have a conceptual model of how the fish population works, and that drives an expectation that we can get sustainable management from it if we pair the science with an enforceable set of regulations. So the reference points and what we call control rules are how we go for this. And from that, we can end up evaluating, well, what is the status of the population? Are they above or below the reference points? And importantly, we can now forecast what level of catch over the next few years will guide us towards, that magical maximum sustainable yield level. Next slide. So here I draw another picture showing essentially what scale of model do we attempt. And it very much depends upon the data that are available. We all know that the system works with a lot of complexity. There's habitat factors, there's interactions with other species, climate drivers. Some populations are highly spatially distinct, and there's other factors that are just impacting these populations all the time. With what we call our age-structured models, and I'll show you that shortly, we try to get a reasonable single species, usually approximation for how the population is responding to as many of these factors as we can, without actually dynamically including those factors into our models. We've not set our sight at having all of those connections modeled because we were able to do it in so few instances today. We retain it as a goal and we keep moving towards including more and more. But basically, our gold standard for a pretty good assessment today is one that achieves these age-structured features that I'll show shortly. But in many cases, we are not even able to do that. And we scale back to what we call a biomass dynamics model, a very simple model of the trend over time of the total population. And in other cases, we scale down even further to what we call the data-limited methods, where we usually don't know much more than how much catch is happening, even if that, and have some degree of life history information, oftentimes borrowing that from other species. So we have quite a wide range of potential availability of data to drive our work. Next slide. So here's an example of one of those data-rich assessments. This comes from the US West Coast for Pacific hake. And on the upper left, we see the time series of catch over time. In the middle, there's an acoustic survey that is giving us a measure of the trend in the population over time. You can see that each point has a fair degree of uncertainty to it, and all the points still don't fit the model, which is in the blue line. The other type of information we have in this case is the age data from the population. We have it both from the fishery and from the survey, and notably for this particular species, there's very, very noticeable patterns in the age data. So the diagonals of bubbles you see going up to the right in the diagonal are tracking large recruitments, large year classes that are entering the population. And other years, there's very, very small year classes entering. So that provides us a high signal of how age groups enter the population, support the fishery for a number of years, and then slowly die out and get replaced by others. On the bottom are what we estimate from this, an estimate of the relative abundance of the population over time relative to the red management target line, which shows that for this population, we actually have been able to maintain it above the target level of biomass, except for all these natural fluctuations that are happening. And sometimes it has dipped close to that line, but by and large, it's been well above. And in accord with that, on the lower right-hand side, we see the estimated relative fishing rate that has been just barely touching up to the level that would, on average, produce that maximum sustainable yield. But typically, we're fishing at a rate that is somewhat below that in order to provide good biomass and good catch. So this is the kind of picture, the kind of story that we can tell with a complete age-structured modeling of a population. Next slide. Now the tools to do this, I mentioned the age-structured population models. Over the last, well, pretty much 20, 25 years, there's been development all over the world of methods to do this. They tend to get developed regionally. We worked mostly regionally 20, 30 years ago. Over time, we've got more and more cohesive as a community and more sharing of information across these models and looking towards opportunities to be merging more of them and building a next generation that could give us a more complete approach. My own work has been with the SS model, the stock synthesis model, and it is used, and like many of the others, the models themselves, even though developed regionally, are now used throughout the world. In the lower right-hand corner, I show a picture that comes from some of the work by Ray Hilborn and his colleagues at University of Washington and around the world, really, where they pulled together information from the results of assessments like this. And this particular slide is showing that there is a large fraction of the assessed stocks are doing rather well. When I talk about a stock that is having an abundance that is a bit above the target level and a fishing rate that is a bit below the target level, we're doing about just right in recognition of the uncertainty in the system. So where we have the X on this spot, there's quite a number of the fish stocks, and each bubble on here is showing a fish stock from somewhere in the world. And a large cluster of them are just to the lower right of the crossover between the two horizontal and the vertical line, showing that we have a large fraction of our data-rich assessments are producing management systems, supporting management systems that get our stocks in a place to produce a good yield while maintaining a healthy population. Next slide. Now, as we move to the other end of our modeling spectrum, it's important to talk about the methods that could be used in more situations where we don't have access to that kind of information. Again, all over the world, there's been a development of better and better methods to try to access life history information, catch information, to be able to share what we know across fish stocks in order to infer how well a particular stock is probably doing given a much scanter amount of information about that stock. So some of these methods in the upper left are based just upon looking at the catch over time, treating that time series as something that tells us something about the sustainability of that population. In the middle, there's discussion and reference for methods that add to the catch information about the life history. And then on the upper right, bringing in some data collection, something like the mean length of fish that are being caught in comparison to the mean length of fish that you would expect if the population had not been fished. We can calculate that mean length that you'd expect without fishing from the life history information and compare that to recent observations to infer from that how hard has this fish population been fished over time, given how it looks today. Now, testing of these methods is what we talk about here at the bottom of this slide, where the simulation testing of various possible ways of doing it is the evolving methods to get at a better understanding of how well can we actually do with a data limited method, and what would be the benefits of collecting more information, and what would be the potential benefits for fishery of being managed according to information that's like that. And so our ability to do simulation testing has become a very important part of our whole assessment methodology. Next slide, please. We call this methodology management strategy evaluation. And basically it takes the population modeling that we've been talking about so far and embeds it into an interactive loop. On the left-hand side is something we call an operating model. This is a model that we believe represents how the population probably works. And we actually will produce tens or many more possible permutations of such models because we don't actually know, but we have a reasonable idea of how the populations operate. And so, that's something that we can run from that model. We can produce potential observations. We could feed those observations into whatever type of assessment model, whether it's data limited or data rich. We could feed some information into that, and from that estimate how we would propose to manage, and then feed that management back into our operating model. This kind of closed loop simulation is what we increasingly use in order to understand how our methods actually are working, in order to bring into the system more of what we call structural error, not just the statistical error in sampling error and things like that, but actually structural error on how close is our approximation to how the population works. Next slide. So here, briefly is an example of a Management strategy evaluation, this one being done in Northern Europe for horse mackerel, where it shows that there's some degree of species interactions between hake, sardine, and Atlantic mackerel, and they're looking at the performance of what we call the harvest control rule, which is down here in the lower left-hand corner. Next slide. And really, very similarly, here from the US Northeast region is that a control rule evaluation using MSE for Atlantic herring. And here again, it's looking at, well, if we are fishing, what's the impact for the availability of herring for birds and for important higher level predators? How well can we understand that trade-off? And when we do these MSEs, increasingly it's designed to evaluate how well we are meeting our objectives. And we can't do that unless we have a high degree of interaction with the stakeholders. So you see in this picture here, a workshop with about 65 people representing various aspects of the fishery and other clients in order to get their feedback on our modeling so that we could tune the model to try to answer their questions. You can see that they evaluated over 5,000 potential alternatives. Next slide. So in wrapping up, let me just say that our assessment approach is best if we can feed into it data on abundance, biology, and catch. The assessment models, when they have this information, we can estimate the hindcast, 20, 30, 50 years of abundance and fishing mortality by assimilating these data. This provides a basis for status determination by comparison of the results to the reference points. It allows us to project sustainable catch levels. The methods are tailored to the data availability, and they include data-limited methods that can provide partial advice. And finally, the management strategy evaluation is a way to embed these assessment concepts in a closed loop to test performance. I'm going to wrap up now, but if I had another 2 hours to talk, I'd be talking about ensemble models in order to better evaluate the uncertainty in our methods. I'd be talking about expanding to multi-species modeling so that we're able to take into account the important interactions between the species and the fact that our fisheries commonly catch many species together. And I'd also would be very much wanting to talk about how it is that changing ocean conditions are affecting everything that we see out there, and we need to be better at including that in our work. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Rick. That was great. Ton of questions, ton of thoughts, and a super overview. Marino, I'm wondering if we could maybe take down the slide, and that way we can see everybody. And if need be, we can, Rick, if you need for us to bring up the slides again to answer a question, we could do that. But that way we can see who all is there. I have a couple of questions, and let me start off maybe and then invite others while people think about their questions. So, in the context of best practices, which is something that we're invited to think about here, is it too blunt to say, well, best practice depends on how much data you have? I mean, in other words, what's the best stock assessment model? And the question or the answer might be, well, it depends on what you have. Like you said, you have data limited cases where you have, as the word says, not a whole lot of data, and then you have, data rich data where you have age structure, size structure, and so on. If we thought about best practices, is it fractal in the sense that best practices then maps out into each one of these cases, or is there a common thread of best practice in this? And maybe related to this, and I'm sorry for going a little bit long, as we get more data, and you talked about how a lot of stock assessment, builds on assimilating past data, right? How do we make that transition of what might be a best practice with one set of data that may have been data limited, and then all of a sudden, let's say you become data rich. And so there's challenges in changing methods as you go along. So I'm not sure if I asked questions understandably, but it's just some thoughts that came to mind.
Sure, sure. Thank you for that, Cisco. And again, thanks for this opportunity. Yeah, I'm sure what you describe as the range of methods applies in other situations as well. It's like, how well can we understand the ocean from just surface observations versus having full profiles, or if we don't have a snapshot every 3 months of the ocean conditions, and instead we have buoys that are giving us continuous observations. I mean, I'm sure every field to some degree has scalability of the observations, and the methods will, hopefully be fairly smoothly scalable across it. And but there may well be some disjuncts as well. We've worked hard with some of our assessment modeling, in particular my work with the stock synthesis model, and Jason Cope, one of my colleagues at the Northwest Fisheries Science Center, has really pushed the envelope on this, is to take advantage of the fact that the population model and the observation model are separate components. That if we could be modeling the population, and from that model of the population, we can derive predictions for a whole range of different types of data. And if we don't have some of those types of data, so be it. We still can work towards calibrating a model with the data that we do have. So he has taken it and scaled it down to doing very data limited assessments using the full age structured internal structure that's in the SS model. And it's by taking the conceptual approach of separating the population model from the observation model that allows us not to be too driven to the particular data we have, and instead be more scalable about it. So that if we start off with something that's data limited and we can't give it much data, and over time we can add more data, it just goes in smoothly and doesn't cause, oh, now we need a new model. We can just add in more data types. So I think that helps us. And the community certainly thinks about good practices because there's a host of details in the modeling approaches that we have. One of the references, let me just say that at the very top of the chat, there's a list of about 10 sites you can go to get more information. Some of those point to the kinds of activities that we have that are really good practices oriented. We have one that's called capumresearch.org, where we and some colleagues and other organizations have been working towards evaluating what are good practices for how we go about doing some of the details of our modeling. So the concept of going for good practices certainly is there, but realistically, it does end up being tailored within some areas. And I think the data limited has been a distinct area of activity over the last 10 years in particular. And there's always been a large activity on the data rich side.
Great, thanks, Rick. No, that makes a lot of sense. That scalability part makes a lot of sense. Why don't I open it to see if there are any comments or questions for Rick? Rick also put some references on the side on the chat for people to see should they come up. But anything for Rick? Either building on yesterday, going to today, or questions that emerged during the very, very nice talk that Rick did.
Hey Cisco, we have hands up from Mackenzie.
I don't see the hand, so there you go, Mackenzie, please.
Thanks for that overview. I have a question regarding stock assessment models of specific types, and for example, for age structured models, you showed how there's different types used in different regions, and I'm wondering if there's a push for consistency within models of specific types. I know that Dr. Bailey recently did a comparison of different age structured models, and I'm wondering if work like hers can maybe push for some consistency with the models, or because I know there's benefits of different model types, but I also think there's benefits in consistency when it comes to comparing the outputs of these different assessments as well?
Yeah, very good question. Thank you, Mackenzie. And I'm part of that project with BI, and actually, I think I was potentially the initiator of that project, and it succeeded beyond my wildest dreams. She did a great job with it, and we learned a lot. I mean, we learned that the 4 of our age structure models that we commonly use in the U.S. Do indeed produce the same result if you're careful about configuring them to do so. To attend to all those details. We did actually in that project find one thing that, this is a little different between these 2 models. It's not a big deal, but we did, because we finally sat down and did that kind of comparison, find that there was a structural difference. There was a workshop last November. It was part of the CAPM series that, again, it's there in my list of references. And that workshop was hosted by New Zealand. There are a number of participants from around the world on it. And the topic of that workshop was, starting to design the framework for what a next generation age-structured stock assessment model would look like. So the community really for probably the last 10 years has been slowly moving more and more towards, we work together all the time. We have, especially in the tuna RFMOs, there's people from all over the globe who come together and work in an assessment workshop format together. And so there's a lot of cross-fertilization. The US brings people from all over the world in to be independent reviewers of our assessments. So we've achieved a lot of cross-fertilization, and our ability to share approaches online is just growing in leaps and bounds. And so we recognize that we are now poised to try to replace our 20-year-old models with something that takes advantage of what we've learned and can provide a framework that we all can use going forward. So the community sort of has that dream. We're mulling around on just how to go about operationalizing it. But that was very much that workshop. And there's one of the papers that's referenced on one of my slides, the Punt et al. Paper, basically recaps that discussion at that workshop, that vision for moving towards a next generation that is going to be faster, better, more connected to ecosystem, more connected to climate, all the good things that we want to have. It's in our sight that we could do this.
And I'll just add that link that Rick gave also, if I remember right, all the talks are recorded, so people can actually go and watch them. It's, I think, 2 to 3 days, and it's I'll just say it's almost like the who's who in stock assessment was there, so it's a really remarkable resource. So thank you for that. I have, let's see, I've got Krista with a question, and then after that, I know that there's a comment from Vardis, and we'll go to that. And so we'll go with Krista, Vardis, and then I'm going to go to Anna. So Krista.
Great. Hello, afternoon. Krista Nichols at the Northwest Fisheries Science Center. I just had a quick question about how stock assessments or next generation stock assessments are taking into consideration population structure. So we kind of embarked both within the context of the strategic initiative, but more locally here too with the Northwest Center with our FRAM division to kind of start systematically identifying species for which we don't have population stock structure information so that it could be incorporated. And so I guess I'm just curious on a more global scale, to what degree is sort of stock structure delineation of population boundaries being included in current stock assessments?
Yeah. The concept is certainly out there everywhere. And like Cisco and I were exchanging on earlier, it sort of depends upon the degree of information you have. So you find species broken up into spatial units, and in all cases, an attempt to base those spatial units on genetics, if you have it, life history, if you have it, tag data, if you have it. So our population models are to some degree going to be wrong if we have a grossly wrong spatial structure. in many, many cases, we end up with no spatial structure. It's just, all right, it's all in one population model. And, you know, we hold our nose and squint and hope it's close enough because we just can't do any better. Our models are capable of handling 5 or 6 interacting population units. And, you know, with this next generation, we'll be able to be smarter about, you know, how we do the modeling. So, you know, I'm sure we'll be able to expand that number. At the other end of it, I see another question here from Santos, that we also have work that is operating at a much finer spatial scale, you know, more like the spatial scale of our surveys, where you might create basically a population map that has hundreds of cells. And increasingly that's being done in a dynamic way. So this map, which, you know, lumps and valleys of where the population is, evolves over time. And you know, we're striving for that degree of spatial modeling as well, because that level of modeling is really what you need if we're going to start. Well, the climate's changing and its fish are moving and they're slowly, the amoeba of the population is moving to the north or whatever. Without that scale of model, we're going to be limited in what we can do. So there's definitely is activity at that scale, and there's activity in basically the models that I talked about already to break it up into you know, a few spatial cells to try to get reasonable approximation.
Yeah, thanks, Rick and Kristen. Vardis had a related question. You know, maybe Vardis, you can expand a little bit. I'm just going to read what you had here, where you said, you know, you talked about spatial structure, but you also explicitly bring up environmental information and covariates with environment. And so, what environmental measurements would you think? Obviously, temperatures and fronts come to mind, but are what, and particularly now with big data and other things and machine learning, any thoughts on how to think about the linking with the environmental covariates part of the spatial structure?
Yeah. And it's really important that you bring it up in a spatial context, because, you know, when we have a total population model, well, we sort of need a total environmental index to drive that population model with. And we do some of that, you know, things like, well, we've seen some correlation between a big measure like the Pacific Decadal Oscillation Index, an annual index of the Pacific Ocean, or the El Nino Index, or something like that, that we see correlated with fluctuations in productivity or spatial distribution of the species. And so you see some degree of linkage at that scale. But increasingly, we're seeing it boil down to a finer spatial scale, and we see things like in the Bering Sea, the location of the ice edge is being used as an important index of how productive the population is. Or you know, the bottom water temperature may be used as an index of whether or not the fish are close to the bottom or more off the bottom, and hence whether they're more or less catchable that year by our survey. So we can help calibrate our survey by bringing an environmental index into it. But, you know, fish see the environment that they're in. And so, you know, we're only going to be able to go small ways into good environmental linkage with large scale population models. We really need to have more finer spatial resolution so that we can match up, you know, the fish in this area are seeing this environment and drive our models there. So we have some efforts along those lines, but they're really big modeling efforts. But you know, the idea of being end-to-end modeling with you know, ocean models is certainly there, but the coupling aspects are important, and so much of the fish movement stuff is something that we can't really drive from first principles. It's nowhere near like the ocean physics, and so you know, but we strive in that direction. It certainly is a reasonable goal.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, and of course, then it becomes tricky, because what is it about the environmental structure? Is it the Is it the temperature? Is it the underlying, feeding environment or food environment? Is it who knows and how that changes? So I think that's where maybe some of those connections and with ecosystem models and such that we talked about yesterday also come into play. How to dig in terms of the going beyond the simple, in quotes, correlation of some physical structure and distribution with what is it about the movement that's doing it. Like you said, Rick, it's very hard to tell, to really see what those emerging motions are, emerging movement might be, or behaviors. And that's, I think, one of the big questions that we have in the whole topic of movement ecology that's also coming up. Why do things move the way they do, and when?
Yeah, and as much as our fish observation system is tailored to tracking sort of the adult populations as the primary goal, in order to get, and that tells us what the population is doing over time. It doesn't tell us very much about why. And without having an observing system that covers, the larval stage, and then where are the juveniles, what life stage are they recruiting, what life stage are they showing density dependence in their mortality and growth. There's a whole lot of stuff that happens in the life history of fish that in many cases is before we get very many observations. So it's sort of a black box going from, we know the spawning population produces eggs, and then these recruits show up, 1 or 2 years later in our data collection, and our ability to create a first principles model that tracks them is really pretty limited. And so it's a place that we end up having to skip over that step and recognize that the linkage is there, and focus our modeling on how is this adult population performing, recognizing that that adult population comes from somewhere and it doesn't just magically appear. And we need to keep our eye on the ball of getting a more holistic ecosystem coverage of our observations in order so that we can start getting information on those earlier life stages that really are important for how the environment's affecting the population, how predators are affecting the population. It gets much more complex very quickly, but that's how the real world works.
Indeed. Thanks, Rick. It's a pretty daunting problem when you try to do all that. Let's see, I think I have Anna Lara next, and then Mackenzie, I'm not sure if your hand is still up or you raise it again. But anyway, Anna, please.
Hi, Rick. Thank you for your talk. I'm gonna sort of just get us a bit out of the nitty-gritty. And so in the case that there's a model that you guys have developed and it's working well, is there like knowledge transfer, say, for other sectors? And should the FAIR principle apply to models, for example, in order to, enable other regions to use them as well for their fisheries management?
Yeah, I mean, there certainly are efforts to do that. And it's particularly active in the data limited area. For example, again, one of the references I put there is for the Fish Path group. That's a partnership of a number of people. I think the Nature Conservancy was one of the main drivers for it. But we have people participating. We have NOAA people participating. The data limited work that I mentioned from Jason Cope earlier is feeding into that. And again, it's working to reach out. The tuna RFMOs, tuna fisheries around the world are also vary in the degree of information for them. And so again, the same cadre of 50 to 100 people, they're showing up everywhere and trying to do that cross-fertilization and knowledge transfer, as you say. And we're pretty active in international conferences. We've had stock assessment sessions at the World Fisheries Congress, commonly at the ICES Annual Science Conference. And to the extent that people from anywhere are participating in those conferences, and that'll be even easier now that it'll be a virtual conference, we work on that. There's some groups that have made particular efforts. Norway, I know, has been very active in trying to do outreach to other areas of the world. They've been active in the African zone, it's something that it's there on everyone's agenda to try to make things available. There's limits on how much we can do with everything, but it definitely is something that we strive for.
Thanks, Rick. Yeah, so that's an interesting point, how the models are discoverable and so on. But that's there certainly, I think, is a the models, are they generally publicly available? Or are they? Yeah. They are. Yeah. So
yeah, they are. In fact, one of my links, the last link there, is the one, Fisheries Integrated Toolbox, and that's basically where you can go and download any of our models, and you can do that with some other places as well. ICAT, which is the International Committee for the Conservation of Atlantic Tuna. They're headquartered in Madrid, I believe. They have a website and they have a catalog of similar tools there. ICES makes things available. So yes, you can get the models. And the modeling itself is increasingly moving into an open source approaches. GitHub has enabled people from around the world to be working together on the same code. It's a system that allows us to expand the collaborations quite extensively.
Yeah, and things like GitHub and such can, maybe the best practices will arise from the collective IQ, as people go in there and they develop what the best practices might be in some ways.
Right.
Mackenzie, I think you're back. You had a follow-up or another question?
Yeah, I have another question related a little bit to environmental effects. At least, so, I kind of think when I read about projections for stocks that have analytical assessments, often like the mean or median of some recruitment time series is used. But, I feel like when some of these stocks have so many environmental drivers on recruitment, it would make sense, to consider maybe the environmental effects indirectly through just trying different recruitment levels. And I feel like, that could just be really useful. So I was wondering, if there's discussion on that, because I feel like usually when I read an assessment, it's just one recruitment
right.
Level.
Yeah, it looks like that when you see the final plots. But in almost all cases, that projection is the median of the posterior distribution of thousands of projections that are basically random draws from the possibilities. And to the extent that, if we have a climate projection, even if the climate projection can say that, well, we're probably going to be in the upper 25th percentile of recruitments over the next 5 years, that would be a huge, huge increase in our knowledge. But we don't have that coming from the the oceanographic community, because they're not able to predict the ocean, but they are getting better and better at that. And so they're striving towards these seasonal to decadal ocean models. And once we have that degree of ocean modeling, then we can start understanding better the linkages to the fish and then building it in. But the projections themselves are almost always a stochastic projection. And certainly as we do an MSE, we would be taking into account the range of possibilities because that's where that probability envelope expands from. And it's not just recruitment. In so many cases, our modeling ends up only looking at recruitment, but there's other effects. I mean, there's effects of the environment and other species on fish growth. I mean, you see a lot of variability from year to year in some species in their body sizes and how much growth they put on. And, growth is biomass is catch. And so, having a predictor of fish growth is equally important. In our Southeast region, where Matt Campbell works from, one of our factors that has been had a noticeable effect over the last few years has been red tides causing fish kills. And we don't know how many fish are killed by a red tide. We see dead fish in the water, so we know there's a substantial amount, and we see the indices of population abundance dip down in the following year. So we have some bits of information to do the modeling and the linkage, but not enough to do it in a dynamical way that is driven by the red tide events. What we can still include it in the model by having what we call random effects. I mean, we talk about recruitment being a random process from year to year, sort of centered around what you'd expect from the abundance of spawners, but it's pretty random from year to year. Well, we could treat other things like natural mortality rate as something that also is potentially a random process. And once you do that, then it can be responsive and can respond to the signal that is happening to the population. That red tide signal ends up playing out in the population modeling as a bump in natural mortality rate that year, and then a bump back down the next year. So the evolution of our modeling has gotten more and more flexible to not just treat things as fixed quantities, but rather to say that what's fixed is that there's a probability distribution of this parameter, that natural mortality rate is something that has some mean, it has some variability over time, but what it actually plays out being on a year-to-year basis, we understand that it probably fluctuates. So let's let the model and all the data we're able to put into the model tell us something about what those fluctuations were. And the models can hang together. I mean, you can model things that way, and the more and more information we can put in, the more and more we can refine those estimates. So yeah, climate-driven, environmentally driven projections are definitely part of the goal. Definitely part of the goal. Matt, you had a question, I believe.
Sure. You're talking about the spatial modeling and bringing that down to sound like some pretty refined spatial scales. And so as a person who does a lot of this work offshore, I'm just wondering how close we are on the spatial scale of which we sample relative to what you're envisioning as spatial scales in these models. So as a person that need data and information.
Right.
So, Matt was broken up a little bit, but I hope you can all see it on the chat. I think, Matt, the question was, how close is our field sampling relative to the spatial scale of the modeling? I guess you're trying to say, that you can't always measure what you're trying to model, or vice versa. Is that right? And how important that is? Was that the question?
Yeah, I shut off my video. Sometimes the video streams a little, screws me up. But yeah, that's essentially it. I mean, at the scale that we sample, are we close to what you're envisioning for the spatial scale of the models that you're suggesting we should move to?
Yeah. I mean, so much of our historical approach to sampling is based upon being just intense enough to get good means within regions by a stratified random design concept. But as we move towards more of an expectation of having enough density of sampling to understand the spatial structure of the distribution, to be able to draw a map. Now you need to have samples that are close enough so you see some correlation in order to draw some map of the population. So I think our evolution of expectations for sampling are evolving along with the population modeling itself. So when the population models that I talked about earlier of going for hundreds of spatial cells, well, that sort of matches up with a lot of things like our very extensive bottom trawl surveys that tend to have hundreds of spatial locations. Spatial locations that typically were laid out originally at a stratified random design approach, but we still can post-analyze them with a model-based approach. And you know, there the scale of you know, inferring the population structure is similar to the scale of sampling. And it's something that you don't, I guess you just need to primarily understand, you know, what are the scales, because, you know, we need to be able to work across a range. We can't set our expectation for a perfect matchup in this regard. And so much of it is driven by the fish and the habitat they live on. As you know all too well in your work, doing you know, camera surveys on reef habitats, it's so driven by the habitat. So you really need to take that into account as well. And again, our models can too. We could bring into it a spatial analysis. You know, a fine scale spatial map can be used while we're analyzing the fish population in its spatial distribution.
So I have a general question, you know, really, perhaps really high level. You know, as we talked about, you know, the ocean conditions changing, we also talked about the changes in, you know, the ocean sector use, you know, multi-sector use of the ocean. You know, and on the one hand, we're trying to, you know, really advance the state of the stock assessment models. On the other hand, you know, you brought up the concept of MSEs that tries to look for a different optimum, so to speak. You know, with a stock assessment model, and I'm going to simplify it, the optimum might be the maximum sustainable yield. With an MSE, you're trying to optimize how do I find that optimum between wind farms, aquaculture, fish, etc. What thoughts do you have in terms of where efforts should go in terms of improving these models and assessments? You know, we can get really into a lot of the things that you talked about, you know, better understanding the biology, better understanding the catch. But is there a point where, or are we at a point where we need to consider other factors and for lack of a better term, throttle back from continuing to improve the biology, the catchability, the this and that, the other thing, and say we can give up some of that accuracy or some of that precision because we, you know, because we also need to include other factors. So how does that optimum pace change as the ocean changes in front of us?
Right. The possibility that's more immediately in front of us is going multi-species with models like this. I mean, we can run models like this for a handful of interacting species simultaneously with linkages. It's just technical stuff that, you know, stands in the way. We just need to sit down and write it. And we have. I mean, there's examples of multi-species models. So we can go for providing scientific advice on essentially multi-dimensional across species optimum yield. That's within reach. We set our sights to do it. To go broader to that, to now benefit streams that don't come from fisheries. You know, we have other efforts that are, you know, striving in that direction. And we call them more integrated ecosystem assessments that embed some simpler view of how the fish populations operate, while also bringing to the table, you know, how some of the other sectors operate. And we face this question of model complexity with our management strategy evaluation work as well. We don't necessarily have to have the most detailed modeling of the fish population. You know, the most detailed modeling is what gives us better predictions on where's the fish distribution going to be evolving on time, or the details of exactly what is the available quota next year based upon the details of what we see happening with this population. We need the detailed modeling for a thing like that, but it's not realistic to do it in all cases. And I agree that we will need to shed some of this because we will just get lost in the details if we try to understand the benefit stream from the economics of wind farms, for example, versus fisheries. We will not be able to carry this much fish detail to that, but we'll need to be more detailed about the spatial distribution of the fish populations when we do that. We will need the spatial aspects in order to do that well.
Yeah.
It's a trade-off. There's going to be trade-offs.
Yeah, it's a trade-off even in modeling effort, isn't it? It's yeah, indeed. Rick, maybe you can see the question from
Yeah.
Bart. Yeah.
Yeah, I see that. The data by and large is publicly available. There certainly are standards, but they aren't global standards. Even within the US, we have regional differences in our data. We have some things that go towards national databases, but many things are regional. The only aspect of the fish data that is not necessarily, and that is some aspects of the catch data, that it can be proprietary on the catch data. Because in some cases you could be, for a small fishery, revealing the individual details of a business practice. And so we tend to have to aggregate the fish catch data and certainly the value of the fish catch data before making it available. And so we need to be attentive to that. But by and large, the survey data and aggregate fish data and the like is going to be available. And Cisco, perhaps you could speak about the large efforts that NOAA and the National Marine Fisheries Service has made to go for our making all of our work as accessible as we can.
Yeah, yeah, it's even as part of the data modernization and all of that. Yeah, I should put that link up. We just went through an effort of how we make our data available. How do we make it modernized? How do we modernize our databases? So I'll make sure that we add that into the into the repository, if you will. In terms of how we go about it, it's complicated. I think that we how to adhere to all of those things, how to make it findable and interoperable and so on. I think there's a lot for us to still develop, but we're taking baby steps towards it. And maybe conferences like these, do help in putting a fine point on that.
It's challenging. I mean, I know that in the ICES arena in Europe, pulling together data from the various countries has been a really big deal. It took them a long time. It's really only been about 10 years, I'd say, that they've been getting to be pretty good about having, overall data sets that has clear standards. And, I'd probably look to their efforts to get a good sense of it. And the US is working in that direction across our regions. But even within our regions, some of the fish catch data comes from the states. And so in the Northeast and the Southeast of the US, there are many states that with their own historical systems of how they monitor the catch and record the catch. And so the effort of pulling together all the data to do the stock assessment, if we want to know, well, what is the size composition of all the fish caught by each fishing year in the fishery last year or last quarter, assembling that from all these disparate sources. You have logbook data from the fishermen, you have port sampling at the dealers, getting some kinds of information. They may have, our sale tax receipt that they need to submit. you need to integrate all this information in order to pull it together. So data modernization is something that, getting a better approach to our fish catch data, the data we collect from the fishery, is that, we don't have that problem with our survey data, but the fish catch data is challenging.
See, any other, we've dug really deep into a number of things here. Any totally off the wall questions? How about any off the wall questions or comments or thoughts that people might have?
Hey, Cisco, I can see Mackenzie has her hand up.
Oh, I need to scroll up. Sorry, Mackenzie, I scrolled too far down. Yes, please.
I don't know if it's totally off the wall, but I'm wondering about if stocks, given their amount of data quality and quantity, are assessed consistently globally. For example, like if a given stock were assessed with the NOAA framework, would it be assessed the same way with the ICES framework, given its data availability? And I also know that ICES will change its, like to my understanding, that ICES changes its assessment based on retrospective bias levels. And is this something that should be consistent globally?
I certainly would not say that it should not be consistent globally, and we certainly strive for that. I mean, again, we get together in things like the annual science conference, and we have working groups. And there's an ICES assessment methods working group, and a number of US and elsewhere participants on that working group. The ICES working group system has been very good for the community to get people together from a variety of ways, because it's a very open approach that they do. And so we do get up and with cross-fertilization. There was, well, what you mentioned earlier, Mackenzie, about this method comparison that BI ran for us among 4 US models. Well, that's sort of a follow-up from a project that was done about 10 years ago through ICES with a number of participants, and it resulted in the, was it 2012 World Conference on Stock Assessment Methods. And again, it was people coming together. We had a degree of methods comparison that involved models from ICES and US and elsewhere, doing essentially the same kind of comparison, but nowhere near the rigor of what BI was just able to do. But it did point the way. It did show that, yeah, comparisons like this are important. We've had NRC, the National Research Council, in studies of our assessment approach in the US dating back even longer. And so attempts at model comparisons have been there. And again, BI just raised the bar on what it takes to do one well. But it is important that we strive for the comparable methods. And I'm sure we're not there yet, but you could take the SAM model and you could have put it right into what BI did, and it would have worked just as well.
Boy, Rick, we're making you work here tonight. This is great, but thank you so much for all of this. This is really really informative and educational. Any other questions here? I am going to go off the wall here in a second.
I see something on observation technologies.
Aha, there you go.
Yeah.
So how do you, I'll read it in case some people can't. How do you see new observational technologies and data streams such as AIS in providing complementary independent data on fishing effort distribution for inclusion in assessments?
Yeah, that would work.
So if you don't mind just talking real quick, just a definition of AIS, because maybe not everybody knows what AIS is.
AIS, Tom, who has the definition for AIS? I'm sorry.
It's basically like following things, with a beeper, right? A satellite tracking.
Oh, yeah, yes,
It's
of course.
VMS, but it's AIS, right?
Right.
Virtual monitoring. It's like seeing where the individual vessels are in a fleet.
That's right. And having, I'm familiar with those systems. I just blanked on the acronym. Absolutely. I mean, knowing where fishing activity is happening is an important step in doing better spatial models and in just being certain that we've monitored the total catch. Because, you know, in the open ocean, that is way harder to do. And so, yeah, having that would help. Even within the local US, we're challenged to monitor our recreational fishery catch. In the southeast region of the US, there is a lot more fish caught by recreational fishermen than there are by the commercial fishermen. And it is a whole lot easier to model a few or to observe a few dozen factory trawlers catching fish in the Bering Sea. That's easy compared to monitoring the catch of 1 million people fishing in various ways, off small boats, off docks, in other fisheries. And so monitoring recreational catch is something that, you know, new tools would be quite welcome to add into that. And so, you know, unmanned aerial surveillance, you know, from drones or even from satellite, if you could pull it off, of you know, how much fishing is going on. You can't tell what they're catching, but knowing how much fishing is going on would be something we could find a way to integrate that into our estimates of, well, what is the total effort, and then, well, what is that effort catching?
Right, and then presumably you could do some sampling at the markets and so on, and do the other parts about, you know, size structure, rate structure, and things like that. So you'd have the effort and you'd have the catch, and who knows how all that could come together. Particularly in like we were talking yesterday, in these large scale fishing efforts like the North Pacific and things like that, which would be hard to do a fishery independent survey for.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's a big deal in the U.S. trying to monitor our total recreational catch. And it's something where, you know, it is done exactly as Cisco describes. We get a measure of the total effort and then multiply that by what we see being landed at the docks. And so it's total effort times catch per effort that gives us the total catch. But that total effort historically came from telephone surveys, you know, random digit dialing of telephone surveys to ask people, have you been fishing? And we've evolved that towards methods which are based more upon mail-based surveys, but it's a survey of the populace to see how much fishing effort is being exerted. And so having a more direct, active observation rather than a passive observation of fishing effort would definitely be something we could fit into improving our estimates. On the fish monitoring side, you know, I guess a different response is not the AIS, but having different tools to you know, monitor the fish populations is something that we very much are looking at. And some of it came up in yesterday's discussion. Things like using sail drones in order to monitor things. Well, you know, that's good for the more surface-oriented, more the pelagic animals. But so much of what we do is on the bottom. And we have a lot of technology that we've been throwing at monitoring them. We have camera-based sleds that we tow. We have some degree of autonomous vehicles and we have automated image processing. You know, Matt, again, has been very much involved in all of that effort. The problem is fish have lateral lines. Fish see things coming. They feel things coming. They react. Some fish get attracted to it. Some fish get scared by it. Some could care less. And so it's really hard to get observations of fish unobtrusively. And so, you know, if somehow we had a remote view, long endurance, very stealthy device that could just be patrolling the bottom ocean, that would be wonderful. But so far, you know, the gliders and the things that work well, you know, for oceanographic observations, just aren't ready to do it for monitoring the fish populations. But if we had something, and certainly again, is, wow, that would be a great magic bullet, because then we'd have a different way of going after what are the trends in abundance, where are the fish. And so, totally out of a different dimension is things like eDNA, which now is potentially a way to get the map of the distribution. It's not a fine map, it sort of gives us fish here by orders of magnitude, not how many fish we got in the net when we pulled the net up, but each fish is now spreading itself out over tens or hundreds of meters. So it's easier to detect each fish. And so knowing that some fish are there is a whole lot easier with something like eDNA than it is with, I'm going to drop a camera right here and see if I saw a fish. Well, so I think our goal should be more bringing these things together. You get the eDNA map of generally where things are, and then you can interpret your fine scale observations. You know that, this zero observation in the camera is something that, because there's no fish around, and here it's just sort of a statistical zero. We didn't happen to see one, but there are some fish around, and that helps us in analyzing the data to get it better. And then another totally different way to go at it, and it doesn't give us spatial stuff at all, but would be to use another genetic technique, which is close kin mark recapture. And it basically says that the genes of the offspring are essentially tags that their parents have released. So think of it as a natural tag to the parents. So the parents have produced offspring, and that's tags to them. So if you now can say, okay, we'll get the genetic diversity of the parents and compare that to the genetic diversity of the offspring, you basically have a measure of how many fish there must have been in order to get that degree of matchup. Now, in order to do that calculation, you need to know, well, how many eggs are being produced by each age, and how many of each age are likely around, and what are the mortality rates, in order to create that model to interpret that data. Well, guess what? It basically means that all the calculations that are going on inside of our age-structured population assessment models are the same calculations you need to do in order to do the close kin mark recapture analysis. And so this is something we talked about at that New Zealand workshop that I mentioned earlier. And we came to the realization that, well, it's just another example of, you have a population model, and from that you have an observation model. And close kin mark recapture is another type of observation model we can work on layering on to the population model, and move forward in that direction. So that's a method that can give us, sort of total abundance of the population without the spatial. So there's a lot of activity on a variety of diverse fronts in order to move forward. But that's one that has been helpful in some of the tuna assessments where we have no way of doing surveys for tuna abundance. All the information we get on tuna really comes from the fisheries. And so having something else to bring to the mix is very valuable.
Phew. I was just thinking, Rick, while you were, really getting into the details here and understanding the different things that need to be balanced. In some fields, you went over samples, and then you say, well, I don't need to sample that much. I can throttle back, and I understand that now. It seems like, part of the conversation today has been there's still a lot more that we need to know, and so we are not quite yet at being able to. We're not quite there, to say we know enough that we can begin to simplify and still know what's going on. It seems like we're still in a very much in a growing mode of data collection, model complexity, et cetera. Is that fair, or will we get to a point where I can measure 2 to 3 things, and I'm clearly exaggerating, but I can measure fewer things and still get the right answer?
Yeah, well, I mean, it sort of depends upon whether all you want to know is whether the fish population is going up or down, or whether you want to get towards why, and is the fish population at a okay level. So knowing whether or not it's going up or down is way more straightforward. And to some degree, that was where fish assessment methods started evolving 50 years ago. And there still are advocates today that if we just go out and measure something pretty simple, like, what is the catch rate by the fishermen when they're out there on their first day of fishing, or something like that. And if it's a big number, then, well, there's probably more fish out there, so we can increase the quota next year. Essentially, things can be done and are done that simply in a whole lot of situations. But it doesn't tell you anything about why they're going up and down, and whether or not they're going up from a really low level or they're fluctuating around a high level. So, again, simpler approaches that are just tracking a trend are certainly have a place, but it's limited information. And again, if we want to know why, we want to know overall impacts. If you want to try to link things up, you want to start having building blocks towards ecosystem models, you need to have a little bit more about the process that's going on and not just indicators.
Yeah, oh, indeed. Well, we're 5 minutes away from the half hour, so to put it that way, from completing our 90 minutes. And again, knowing that it's late in some place or in some places, and in some others need to jump to other meetings. Are there any other questions and such? We can try to summarize, again, a very rich conversation today in terms of recommendations or some key points. And of course, I want to thank again Caitlin and Katie for helping us taking these notes, but also to help Caitlin and Katie also summarize these things. I'll just say a couple of things, that came up, and I'm going to invite people to say what they saw as some of the key points. I think that, in terms of, maybe Rick didn't say this, but as I was listening to it, there's a whole host of approaches that can be dictated by a number of different things. They can be dictated by the question, or they can be dictated by the data that's available, et cetera. And something like a best practices might make sense then, in terms of having a repository where you can go and use this, again, the wisdom that goes into, that's gone into creating all of these different approaches to see what might be the approach that you should take. And I think that goes along with models themselves, stock assessment models themselves, adhering to, when possible, to the fair, findable, accessible, reproducible concept. I think that another thing is there's so much knowledge coming into this that I think even as part of FAIR is the FAIR concept is that you don't have to reinvent what's out there. And Rick talked about efforts, community models, using GitHub and other approaches where you don't have to reinvent things. You can build on the shoulders of giants, to put it that way. You can build on things that are already there and add to it in a systematic way. And I think that that's really important, particularly as we get, as our ability to collect data comes online, as our ability to collect different kinds of data come online, how to mix and match all of that. You want to have some systematic approach to do this. And I think, again, I think, Rick, your talk tonight, again, and the richness of all the things that you laid out, really points to that, to being deliberate, and again, I'm using the word again, systematic, about how we develop the modeling approaches, the stock assessment models. Yeah. I'm going to stop there. I'm wondering what other messages people heard. Anybody say something that they thought that they learned tonight?
Scott, we have a few comments coming in the chat box.
Aha, okay. One more question. We're not done. This is like Columbo, just one more question. Yeah, there you go. I'm not sure if you can read it, Rick. I'm not sure what the outcomes of Fisheries Working Group will be, but I think MSC best practices would be really useful. I find that what MSC differs among scientists. Some thinks it needs extensive iterative stakeholder engagement, whereas some studies say simulation framework and never mention the term MSC, even though the framework used it. Right. Any thoughts on that in terms of best practice recommendation for MSCs?
Yeah. It's one of those evolving fields, and I agree that there is some degree of ambiguity, at least, perhaps confusion on just how to best use the term. In some cases, things that are observation system experiments potentially get characterized as a MSE. You asked specifically about the stakeholder engagement, and you can only go so far without it. There's some kinds of questions that you cannot answer without getting stakeholders, because you'll just be providing information about how a system might work, but without getting the stakeholders to tell you what are they interested in. You can't get a multidimensional objective function developed without knowing what people value. And you can't make that up. I can't sit as a scientist at my desk and come up with a really good idea of what the community wants to get out of their fishery. And so that's why you get the stakeholder involvement. If you are asking questions about how do we manage this fishery to achieve multiple objectives? So if that's what you're trying to investigate, then I think you absolutely need it. But if your question is more limited than that, then you could do a desk MSc. You don't need to go to that level. So it depends upon the question you're asking. And Fernando, I'm glad you brought up the data limited situations. I mean, it's real. It's all over the world. It's in the U.S. I mean, we have regions of the U.S. Even some of our data-rich regions still are pretty data poor for some species. And some of our regions, particularly some of our Western Pacific island areas and in the Caribbean, we have situations where we face the same things that you are facing in Brazil in terms of knowledge of the fishery. The methods that we have, they can't go very far without some information. But we do know something about fish, and we can bring knowledge from other species to try to help. And if the local people can work on trying to provide what they know about the history of a fishery, know about, well, how big did the fish used to be in the catch compared to how big they are today. I mean, that's all useful information. There are people in our field who would take a much stricter interpretation of what are good enough data to put into our population models. I don't subscribe to that. And I think our models can provide predictions for a whole lot of things. And whether or not fish are about half as big as they used to be is something that can be used in a model. And so I think we need to be creative about having local people working with their fisheries in order to collect information about what the history looked like.
And there's a comment from, thanks Rick, there's a comment from Anna on with all the models available and the different applications, differing applications, FAIR will be important, but just as important will be the capacity development. And I think that's a very accurate statement on how to use these models for nations that do not have the resources to create these models, but would be good to implement in their region. So I think clearly that is, I'm sure there's efforts on that as well. Rick, I don't want to keep you guys. It's getting a little bit late, but I would say that we echo very strongly the sentiment that Anna expressed there.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. We try, and even with our own modeling work, we hold international workshops. We've traveled around in order to hold workshops in other parts of the world. In fact, in just 2 weeks, it's not something I can open up because it needs to be small in order to be effective. But I'm going to be working with a working shop. It was organized by someone with the FAO in Rome, and we're going to have a number of participants from North Africa who work around the Mediterranean. And we'll be talking about our population models and how they can be used in that region. So we try, but trying to find a way, a mechanism to make it available to more people. There's only so much of us. We can only spend so much of our time operating in that way. And better partnerships with projects like this one to get awareness out there, and with other partners who have some of the resources to organize things. We can just use our experts in a more limited way to help the work along. Anyway, yeah, it's important.
So are there any other messages that came through to folks that we should record? We have, again, the recording itself, as well as the notes. Is there anything that anybody wants to highlight or emphasize? I don't think anybody should use the word multidimensional objective function after 8:30 at night. That's just a bit too much, but it was 8:30 here. Maybe Marino can, because he's awake. But anyway, any other thoughts? If not, this was great, Rick. I want to thank you for a really thorough and chock full of information and insight, very insightful discussion. We'll be collecting the notes. We might come back to you, Rick, if we have questions on them for clarification. And I want to thank everybody for being on tonight. Remember, tomorrow we're going to be talking about the third step in the fisheries process, which will be the provision of management advice, and that'll be with Eva Plagani from Australia. And I think that'll be a really good discussion, because it's that step. How do we take all this data and assessments, and then how do we actually provide the advice? So that should be a really good conversation tomorrow. So other than Marino, Caitlin, and Katie, because I'd like to keep the four of us on, I'm going to wish everybody a good day or a good night. And Rick, special thanks to you again. This was really, really good. Thank you.
Very good. Thanks all for the great questions. So it's a good conversation.
All right. Good night. Good day.
Thanks.